my MA came out of teaching. I got really interested in strategy teaching. This was obviously the 90s, and it was a thing. So I got interested in teaching strategies, did this experiential approach to strategy training, was trying to look at the benefits for the learner. And what came out of that study for me was that the benefits weren't really in terms of linguistic gains. What they were gaining were non-linguistic things. They were gaining agency. They were gaining confidence. They were gaining metacognitive knowledge about learning and their own learning and their own self-regulatory strategies and so on. And so that's what started it, is that I realized that sometimes what leads to effective and successful learning isn't always a direct path from the teaching to the language gains, but there is this whole mediating sphere of psychology and what goes on in the learner's mind and how agentic they feel, how confident they feel, how willing to take risks they are, and so on. And that's what started me on that path. And I somehow carried on that way and have never kind of stopped. And I'm glad. I have enjoyed it and I love it. And I'm just, there's never a shortage of things I want to know or learn. And it's one of those, the more you learn, the more you know what you don't know. And I just feel like there's so much I don't know. I don't even know where to begin. But it's a wonderful field to work in.
It's funny you mentioned this whole idea of learner strategy, the benefits for the learner, agency, self-efficacy. And you're right. This is like goes back to the 90s, and I remember Lessons from Good Language Learners being like one of the seminal books back in the day. But my question then is, do you think that for some reason now, in this new era with social media, with this attention economy, don't you think, because currently I think we all teach here, and one of the things I've noticed is I feel like my learners have lost the ability to learn properly, to have agency over the development, to understand strategies that would help them become better language learners or better learners in general. And I noticed that textbooks also don't have that as much. There seems to be, I think the pendulum has swung in a different direction where the focus now is more on social justice, inclusivity, and all these things at the expense of these other also important things. So my question to you then is, isn't it time that perhaps we spend more time talking about the psychology of learning? What happens with the learner as they are being taught a lesson? Because as you said, a lot of these things are not just linguistic, but they're also psychological, right?
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I mean, you're talking to the converted here. So I think, so the good language learner studies, of course, were decontextualized. It was this idea that if you knew what a good language learner did, you just had to transfer it. So, it was conceptually flawed, but it wasn't totally flawed. Looking at what good language learners does gives you some idea of how they approach their learning. What are they finding effective? It doesn't mean you can do a one-to-one transfer. And some of that interpretation was indeed flawed, but I think there was an enormous amount of value in knowing how to learn. And I don't know about your context, but how many textbooks, how many schools, how many universities teach their learners how to learn? We just assume that people know how to do it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about knowing what resources are available. That's a very different set of things. They know more resources than I do. They've got more access to extramural English than I will ever have. I learned a whole new thing today that my students taught me today about Twitch. I've never heard of Twitch, didn't even know what it was. So they are going to be teaching me stuff, not the other way around. But when it comes to how you approach learning and what strategies you can have and developing a sense of agency and empowering them to know their own boundaries and know where they can explore and know how to self-regulate, that's invaluable. And again, you come back to things. Some of that will be specific to language learning, and some of it is generic about how we learn. And I think I'm very sorry that we have lost that focus, and very much wish that we could return a little bit to that. And I think the students at the moment need it desperately.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't think anybody teaches them at any point how that they should learn. I think we assume, particularly maybe even with English, I think we assume that because the resources and access to English is there, that they know how to learn. And those are two very different things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at the risk of oversimplifying it, how do people learn? Or you seem to mention a divergence there from resources available that help people learn versus the actual process of learning to learn. And you mentioned a couple of things there. Maybe those are your tenets in terms of agency and autonomy and those kinds of things. it's an unfair question because the answer is not simple. But what are one or two things that you would put on that, Mount Rushmore, I guess, of learning to learn?
I think self-regulation is a big thing. And I think you talked a little bit earlier, you mentioned the word attention, you talked about being able to manage distractions, being able to focus for longer periods of time, being able to self-regulate, I think is more important than it has ever been. I think this idea that you set goals and you can assess your progress and make sure that you're making progress to them and manage distractions and know what your triggers are and know how you manage that. I think all that kind of regulated. Geez, we need it. Never mind.
I was just going to say that adults don't have that. Yeah.
I don't have it. Never. Don't get me here as holier than thou. So I think all of this sort of ways of managing our attention. You talked about the attention economy, understanding that attention is a valuable resource. What you give it to creates your reality. So there's a lot to be said for understanding the fact that your attention is a valuable resource to you, and what you give it to matters to the quality of life that you lead. Mm-hmm. And that is in terms of social media and the kind of news and the kind of reporting and the kind of people that you choose to engage with. But that's also very much in terms of if you want to learn, you are going to have to invest, if we're going to use that metaphor of economy, some of your attention in that process. And how would it be wise to invest it? In what ways would it make sense? Where would be a sensible use of your attention? Mm-hmm. So I think I think we need that. Never mind the learners.
Oh yeah.
And so I think that's a huge part of managing your learning nowadays in a very, very competitive environment where there's something pulling on your attention all the time.
Is that an argument for, I'm wondering, just thinking out loud, is that an argument for in-person learning? Because I'm just thinking about myself. I'm teaching a class in person for the first time now in 4 years since the pandemic happened. And I was joking with Leo, but I wasn't joking. It was real. When I'm teaching online, talking about like divergence and distractions and attention, I've got like 19 screens open. I'm doing a whole bunch of different things. Breakout rooms are happening and I'm planning the next task. Even sitting here talking to you right now, I've got all the recordings going on. I'm taking notes over here. Like the online stuff is just, I think, naturally distracting, or you just open yourself up to all of these things, whereas in person maybe it's not. Is this an argument for in-person learning just from that psychology perspective?
I intuitively want to say yes, but I'm wary in that I don't know that that's a justified yes. But I think there are so many other benefits to being in person, particularly in relation to language learning. And I do think that a core part of being a language learner and a language user is also developing interpersonal competences. Language is about communication. Whatever language it is that we're learning, it's about communication and communicating with other people. That's the foundation of learning a language, whatever language that might be. And a core part of that is not tied to any specific cultures or target cultures or is about interpersonal competences. Mm-hmm. And we can develop those in the language classroom as part of working together. And I think there's a lot of benefit for language teaching when students learn to communicate with each other in diverse settings within the classroom in ways that just don't happen online. Mm-hmm. No matter how brilliant your breakout room management and how funky you have your classes, sitting in person or having people stood up or having them move around the room or have them form different groups, that in-person form of communication is very qualitatively different. And I think as part of teaching the language, we can be teaching these interpersonal skills at the same time. In the good old days, it was communicative competence. But of course, that became tied up also with notions of culture at the time and so on. And I think I would take it back a step from there and say communicative competence is still a core part of it, but maybe it is non-culture specific. It's about interpersonal competence. Right. It's about being able to communicate with other people, learning to listen, having empathy, being able to imagine how your communication is affecting them and how they feel about your communication, and being able to collaborate and work together as a group. I think all of those are core parts of communication. And so maybe some of these good old-fashioned communication studies have a lot to teach us. That so it's not just about language, it's about communication and being together as people.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I was teaching a class just today. And even though the students were in class, and we're going to talk about engagement, and I felt like they were engaged, I was still somehow competing with their phones because
Yes.
they're always going to be checking their phones.
Yes.
Which brings me to the question of attention. And perhaps we can, before we jump into engagement, I remember you talking, I think it was one of your, I don't know if it was your ITEFL talk or if it was another talk, where you were talking about the shrinking of attention spans and all the challenges that Andrew just mentioned right now, posed by all these digital distractions that we have. From a perhaps practical perspective, Sarah, how should teachers adapt their teaching methodologies, their teaching strategies to somewhat mitigate the impact of these issues? And the example that I'm thinking of is this generation of learners, they need to be constantly engaged, on task, and as you said, communicating. The moment the teacher spends, and I'm looking at methodology here, and I'm thinking about a PPP framework, where the teacher spends 20 minutes presenting language, the students are lost. So PPP doesn't work with this younger generation, in my humble opinion. So with the shrinking attention spans and all these challenges, what, in your opinion, as someone who is very well versed in this and researched this, what are some strategies that teachers can adapt or use in their teaching to address these things more effectively?
Well, there's two things I'll say if I don't lose my track. So the first one is we can't compete with the phone. So that's a lost battle. You can't, you're never, there is a reason why this is called an addiction. And you as an individual teacher can't compete with that. So I think some of the conversation we've just had about developing self-regulation, about managing your attention, about being very explicit with learners about how this can be damaging and helpful. Now, at different age groups, that conversation is going to be more difficult, but I think there is a place to make this conversation explicit. We don't have to be doing it implicitly all the time. You know, this was the old debate about strategies. Can we have do they have to be implicit or explicit? And I think when we're talking about attention, we're talking about self-regulatory strategies, managing attention, managing distractions. Certainly, as you get older and more mature, I think learners are capable of having very explicit conversations about that. Now, going back to the sort of other practical side of that, although I think that's quite a practical approach with some level of learners that you can have, but I think another very practical approach is I think we just have to be guided by in what way can we make these activities more active? Everything. If we're going to be doing grammar, right, let's start with a deductive approach. Let's get them to work out what is the grammar. You know, these are things that exist. These are not things that, these are approaches that already exist. They're certainly not created by me and I have no input on those. But if we know that the key is learners need to be active, and like you say, Leo, PPP, giving them some forward frontal input, even with my students at university, 5 minutes, if I'm lucky, they'll give me, and then they're done with me, and then I've used up my time. So I think anything that gets them active from word go, these fast starts where you get them straight in, okay, quick, speedy activity to begin the lesson while I'm getting stuff sorted. Because if I'm getting stuff sorted, they're on the phone, they're distracted, it's gone. So literally the minute you go, you come in and you say, okay, last lesson I'm making stuff up now, I'm talking rubbish, but last lesson we talked about, I don't know what's in the course books that I've been looking at recently.
Writing an email to a professor.
Right, writing an email to a professor. Okay, just jot down 10 pieces as quickly as you can. First group to finish, put their hand up. 10 pieces of advice. What makes a good letter to good email to a professor? Go. And then you go and do something else, and then you come back, and that's enough. And that's a summary of last lesson. But it's at speed, it's at pace, they are doing it, it's student directed. And we have to kind of reframe everything from that lens is how can we do this activity with the same learning outcome, but keeping them as the ones who are active and keeping our input more as facilitative and guidance. If we've got some grammar that we have to teach, some grammar aspect that we wish to focus on, starting with a deductive approach. Did you work it out? You are the language detective. I'm going to make you a language detective. I'm going to give you some text, and there's a rule in here, and I want you to work it out. So get yourselves in groups. You're in groups of 3. You're a language detective. You see if you can come up with the rule. What is the rule here in the language? And then you give it, and off they go. And then you say, okay, now let's see if you're right. Test it out with each other. Test out everybody's rules. See if it works. So it's just as if it was so easy. It does require us to rethink. It requires us to look at what we're doing. If we've got, let's say the worst, most awful activity, you've got a course book and you've got 10 gap fill activities that you have to do. that you say to the guys, right, we've got 10 gap-fill activities to do there. I want you to pick the 6 that you want to do and ignore the other 4. And they still have to read all 10 in order to answer 6. Or that you say, I think these are pretty boring. And don't you? Do you think these are boring? I think these are quite boring. You take these, let's take 5 of them. You choose 5, get the same verb, but make it a much more interesting sentence. So it's not reinventing the wheel. It's not going completely away from what we're already doing. It's just seeing where we can maximize learner autonomy, learner decision making, where we can maximize their action and bring them into it's like learner centered on steroids. How can we really make them be the center of what they do? You know, how can we make them really be the ones who do everything? And you know what? And then we come to the other teacher, that's high energy. That's hard work. And so, you know, I'm not under any illusions that that's easy. And you know what? There will be lessons where teachers go in and they open the book and they teach from the book and that's it. And you know what? That's okay too. We can't every lesson be Wonder Woman. That isn't going to work, and it's an express road to burnout. So, and if we have lessons like that, we don't beat ourselves up over it. That's life. And your students are not going to be damaged irreparably just because they've had one crappy lesson from you. Yeah. And so I think it's about giving ourselves a bit of a break, knowing that we're working in quite challenging circumstances, and maybe sometimes being realistic about what we can achieve because we're competing with something very difficult. But maybe also looking at what we're doing anyway and seeing, is there a way that we can think about this in a way that's going to animate and activate the learner more, so that the key is that they're in control.